So, this story comes from the 70s when my grandfather dropped my grandmother and mom and her two sisters off to do some shopping on his way to work. Since he wasn't able to pick them up, they hitchhiked home. My mom at the time was only around maybe 10 or 11. Her middle sister would have been 7 or 8 or so, and the youngest was about maybe a year old, but they get picked up by a guy in a pickup truck, who has them all set in the back row with one of them holding the baby. My grandmother was giving directions to their home from the highway, but the guy ignored her and went past their exit, claiming that he had to make a stop first. He didn't really say much else after that to them during the drive as well. My mom remembers my grandmother being very quiet and very nervous, but eventually they came up to a farm and the driver tells them to wait in the car and goes inside the house. While he's gone, they just sort of sit there terrified. I mean, they're in the middle of nowhere and know that they couldn't make it out on foot. A few minutes later, the driver comes out with a second guy who looks into the truck and sees my mom's younger sister, and he immediately starts flipping out, screaming at the driver that he shouldn't have brought the baby back there. They aren't going to do anything with her and some other things that I can't remember, and ends up telling him to get them away from the farm. The driver gets back into the truck, apologizes, and they get back on the highway and drive again in silence. My grandmother, normally a very smart woman, had him drive directly to their house of all things, although I suspect her reasoning was that she'd already given him the address before anything seemed off, but thankfully they lived at that house for several years and luckily enough, never saw either of them men a second time.
So, my name is Charles and I'm an assistant manager at a sub shop, but back when I was just a shift manager, we had this employee named John. John was only working for us for about a month when he called us up to pick him up from his roommate's house because of some problems that they were having. We took him to our place and had a couple of drinks, and we ended up sort of cheering him up. He was always quiet about his social life though, but he would talk to other people on Tinder and meet up with dates, or would go to a store that he liked shopping at that was across the street from us. He stays with us for about maybe 2 weeks, and he tells us that he planned to hang out with a friend. My fiancé gives him a big hug, since they became really good friends. He leaves our place and just doesn't really come back for a couple of days. We get worried and try to get into contact with him, but somehow, we just couldn't find his profile or him on any social media platform, and whenever we called him, his line was disconnected. Honestly, it was almost like he just disappeared. He left all of his personal belongings behind too, along with his clothes. This was just very out of character of John to do. So we were trying to figure out what happened and hoped that he would still be with his friend, but we eventually just accepted that maybe he just left with no warning. Anyway, a couple of days go by and I'm at work in the middle of my shift and I see this really tall middle-aged man walk into the store to get a sub, and as I began to bring it out to him, he kind of just stares at me. I look back and I ask if I knew him, and weirdly he asks about John, and this really creepy vibe just radiates from this guy. I asked him what kind of affiliation he had with John, and he just looked at me again and said he was a good worker. Then he walked out and I never saw him again. But then we got a call on the store phone, which so happened to be his grandmother, who apparently had filed a missing persons report because she was someone that he spoke to every day, and ever since then, there has been no trace of him. Something tells me that the guy had something to do with it, but something also told me to stop asking questions. He gave me a huge chill down my spine. I don't know where Johnny is. We haven't heard from him since then, neither has his grandmother, and it's been a long time now, but wherever he is, I really hope that he's okay.
So, I should clarify before I begin that we're no longer friends. It all started when we met in primary school, year 4. I just joined a new school and was assigned a person to stay with me and introduce me to other people. Her name was Jay. She seemed nice enough. Her mother was in the PTA, and a very kind woman, but Jay was always just really odd. She would look at me like I ruined her life or something, always staring with her hand behind her back. Anyway, skip forward to when we were at secondary school. Jay and I were at her house. Her parents had gone out for the night. We were baking brownies, when I turned around to get a baking tray or something, and the moment that I grabbed it and turned back to her, I saw her slip something into the brownies. I sort of brushed it off and decided that my eyes were playing tricks on me. Later that night, when the brownies were done, and we had them out on the plate ready to eat, I heard a knock at the door. I got up to open it but froze when I reached the door because I heard Jay get up and walk out of the room yelling, "She's going to the bathroom." She went like 5 minutes ago though. I remember what I got up to do when I heard another knock at the door, followed by a female voice yelling help. I ran to open it but I got a really bad feeling, so decided to put the chain on it first, but when I did there was nobody out there. I felt weirded out and really scared, so I put a movie on and waited for Jay to come back. After calling my mother to tell her what had happened, she told me that she was going to pick me up soon. I realized that I had forgotten about the brownies, so to calm my nerves I took a bite. Food always helps, right? All I remember after that is waking up in a hospital and never seeing Jay ever again. In fact, nobody's seen Jay for like 4 or 5 years, including her own parents.
So, thankfully I can talk about this now, as I'm no longer with the company that I once was at. I just didn't want my boss or colleagues to think that I was a crazy person. Anyway, here it goes. So, in 2018 I was working for a company installing video conferencing solutions, and one particular job took me to a mental health facility in Brisbane, Australia. It was called Walton Park Hospital. Originally, it was called the Waguru Lunatic Asylum. It's a large part of a precinct with multiple buildings, many dating from maybe like the 1860s, and has quite a sinister history with the reports of intolerable living conditions, terrible assaults and abuse, and even mass burials. The main hospital now lies abandoned and is frequented by adventure seekers. However, my job on this day was based in one of the small wards. It was called the Bostock House. It was built in 1885, and I don't think this building has housed patients for quite some time, and it still seems to have the original structure and layout of like a 19th century psychiatric ward, with rooms that are more like prison cells. The ground floor has one main open area, possibly a day lounge area, in its time maybe. It features a large boardroom table that is used by local community groups for meetings and such, but this is where I was to install the video conferencing system. There is another large fully enclosed room directly behind this space, maybe about 15 meters or 50 feet down a hallway, and the rest from memory is pretty much just hallways with cells. When I arrived, I was met by the customer, an elderly gentleman who remained in the room with me the whole time while I set up the hardware. There was nobody else in this building that I was aware of, and after finishing the installation, I needed to test the equipment. So, I took my laptop into the other room. I sat at one of the desks, but there were a few in there, and connected a two-way video session to the main conference room equipment. The customer and I had like a 5-minute call, which all went well with the door closed. In this room you could not hear anything coming from outside, so it was a good test scenario. I wanted to swap places with the customer and have him come into the room to experience the video and audio from my laptop as well. So, I left the live meeting connected and went out to the conference room to suggest this. When I got there, we first had a brief conversation, and during this time we both noticed some strange noises coming through the feed from my unattended laptop back in the other room. It sort of sounded a bit like maybe rustling of pages, some chair scrapes I think, and very clearly a man coughing. But as I couldn't really see anyone on the video feed, I assumed someone had entered the room and was out of camera view. I was thinking, large room, small laptop camera, the more obvious possibility of someone remotely joining the meeting was basically impossible though due to the custom security protocols that I use. It was at this point that the customer asked if I had brought someone with me that he didn't know about, and of course I said no. I also said that I thought that maybe there was another staff member in the building, but then he said that not that he knew of, and we sort of both just looked at each other for a second in bewilderment. I proceeded back to the room expecting it to now be occupied, but when I did there was no one there. I again spoke to the customer on the video and it all seemed normal, the noises had stopped. I again went back out to the conference room and we stood in silence for about 30 seconds and then the noises started up again. This time I ran back to the room and again it was completely unoccupied and the noises had stopped. At this stage I felt the customer was getting a bit uncomfortable with the situation and I was also getting a bit freaked out, but as I had to maintain a professional manner, I decided not to make a big deal about it. I closed my laptop and joined him back in the main room, and just as I was about to make a funny quip and say my goodbyes, the building's fire alarms went off. We both visibly jumped but settled immediately to deal with the situation. We went to the alarm control box but there was nothing that we could do to stop it. I stayed with him while he called the facility services and within around 10 minutes a tech guy came out and stopped it. The three of us stood for a few minutes, talking about how the tech couldn't remember it ever going off before in the years that he'd been there, apart from tests that is, and then lo and behold it goes off again. At this point I felt I didn't need to be there and so I left quite briskly. Before I end this though, just to answer a few points of clarification, there is no possibility that another party had joined the meeting. It was a secure two-way connection and someone would have needed a very specific code that only I knew to have joined it. I checked my laptop to make sure no other media was playing in the background. It was a fine, calm day, not windy at all. It seemed pretty clear to me that there was nobody else in the building, but I admit that I can't be 100% certain, I guess. But, even if there was, I really just don't see how they could have exited the room quickly enough to avoid my detection, especially that second time when I ran into the room. Also, I do have a background in science and to be honest, I would prefer to find a logical worldly based explanation for this, but this one, it honestly just has me stumped. I acknowledge that there's a lot that we just don't understand about the universe yet, and after this experience, I must admit that I now have a somewhat more open mind.